Communication and Cultural Policy at the School of Communication. Sarah is an expert in the areas of media governance and media policy in the digital area, content industries, comparative and cross-border research. And she is the lead PI of the project and exploration of independent journalism's epistemologies, enhancing democratic resilience in the age of disinformation, funded under the tab Democracy, Governance and Trust call in 2024. So, Sarah, I hope we can't still hear you. May I suggest you try to log out and again log in? Maybe that would work. So I think nevertheless, let's see. So my suggestion would be, because we are conscious of the time and it's already past 3 in the UK. Luke, can I just invite you to carry on while we are trying to resolve the sound issue with Sarah? And just a gentle reminder, 5 minutes is the time limit here.
We set your course up.
Yep. Hello, everyone. So our project is I'm the lead.
3,
and
8,
the co-leads
9 isn't available right now. When you hear the beep, record your message.
It's kind of making quite a lot of noise, Manija.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, so our project is called Forest Citizenship for Disaster Resilience, Learning from COVID-19. And we're defining forest citizenship as the claiming of rights by people who have achieved legal territorial recognition and who attempt to conserve their forests. And we're using forest citizenship as both a normative framework and analytical tool. Next slide, please. So we're a Brazil, UK, US team. We're mostly new collaborators. We have 1 university in the US, 2 in the UK, 4 institutions in Sao Paulo state, and we're working as closely as we can with 3 Amazonian institutions, or institutions that have a presence in Amazonia. Next slide. So a project we were trying to advance comprehension and ultimately improve forest people's capacity for recovery, renewal and resilience. So whilst we were using COVID-19 as our case, we're really interested in future disaster resilience and also the disasters that have occurred between COVID-19 and the present day. So we wanted to try and quantify the linkages between forest citizenship and COVID-19, which was one work package. The qualitative work package was trying to understand practices of forest citizenship in relation to COVID-19 experiences. And ultimately, we want to disseminate learning from these qualitative case studies for how we can try and enhance disaster resilience in other parts of the Brazilian Amazon. So we're a very diverse team in a disciplinary sense, ranging from economics to rural sociology, agrarian studies, etc. Next slide. We began with collaborative work on theorizing forest citizenship, thinking about it as a Latin American form of ecological citizenship, where we place more emphasis on rights rather than responsibility. So we're seeing this territorial recognition as providing marginalized populations in the Amazon with the right to have rights. Methodologically, we began using demographic techniques and ultimately estimated that there are over 1 million forest citizens in the Brazilian Amazon. They're inhabiting over 1,400 such territories. So this is covering over 30% of the entire Brazilian Amazon. And we were identifying territories in which there was bottom-up creation and then later some level of participatory governance. So another example of the quantitative methods was using econometrics to assess whether territorial recognition has improved birth-related health in Amazonia, including during COVID. So that was using like millions of birth records. And the short answer is no, it has not yet led to overall improvements in birth-related health. Next slide. Qualitative field work focused in towns and rural areas in and around 2 extractivist reserves in Pará and Amazonas. We'll be looking at collective action, the role of NGOs, relationships with the state, and that's led to 2 PhDs which are ongoing. We tilted towards participatory action research as well in support of Brazil's first common use territory in the Rio Manincoré in Amazonas. So we've combined fieldwork, gathering data with advocacy, follow-on funding for participatory management plan. We've funded a community enforcement base. And very interestingly for us, the Turkey is based on shared practices of common use rather than bounded identity categories. So the formation of the TUC has happened largely outside of state or federal institutions. Next slide. So beyond COVID, many of the riverine populations we were working with have been affected by very severe droughts in 23 and 24 and some floods. So in some cases, we refocused our research away from COVID towards these more immediate challenges. We worked hard to try and develop creative solutions for supporting capacity building of early career researchers in Amazonia. We've developed something of a focus on education as well as a social determinant of health. And we delayed some of our dissemination and impact activities linked to a no-cost extension until late August 2025. I think my time is now up.
Sarah, do you want to give it a try?
Yes, hello everyone. Do you hear me?
Great.
Yes, okay. Hello from Vancouver, Canada. I'm sorry about the mix-up with the audio. I figured it out. Thanks so much, Luke, for the presentation. Yeah, we go next to Alex Shankland, Building Back Better from Below. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, everyone. Yeah, and thanks to TAP Partners for creating this opportunity. Particularly, it's great to be presenting alongside Luke because we're connected in the previous TAP conference, and we've since invited Luke to present his findings at the University of Sussex, and that's a productive dialogue. We've also collaborated closely with another TAP project, PanX Youth, which was presented yesterday, led by Lauren Andre from UCL, and my colleague Jenny Constantine, who is with us, along with one of our key community partner organizations, Bridging Change, Director Anusri Biswas Duran, will be able to speak to those partnerships and how we're engaging in policy in the UK. So very briefly, we worked across 3 cities in the UK. That's Brighton on the south coast of England, which is the closest major urban centre to the University of Sussex, where I'm based at the Institute of Development Studies, Sao Paulo in Brazil, and Toronto in Canada. The project's name, well, it's been shortened to B4, Building Back Better from Below, but really came about from a shared desire to learn with and from grassroots innovations in responding to the pandemic and to examine their sustainability and potential for wider impact. And the innovations on which we focused coalesced around 3 core themes, which were united by a common focus on racial justice. So we were looking particularly at reducing inequities in access to healthy food, reducing inequities in access to primary healthcare, and reducing inequities in access to political voice and representation across the 3 cities. And as I say, we work particularly with racialized and marginalized communities, and that also led to an analytical focus on the intersections between not only the COVID-19 pandemic and the responses to it, but also the Black Lives Matter protests, which coincided with the first phase of lockdown in the UK, and related mobilizations across Canada, Brazil, and much of the world. So we're looking at learning and networking and social movement building among marginalized and racialized communities across 3 cities. But we're also looking at official response in the terms of food policy, health policy, and the political system's response to the challenges of representation, as well as the challenges of health inequality and food justice that the pandemic intensified and revealed. So in each of the cities, we built very strongly on partnerships with grassroots and social movement actors. So in Canada, a team led by my colleague Suzanne Sikier from the University of Toronto, who sent her apologies. She's actually on a plane right now, otherwise she would have presented this work herself, was anchored in a really strong partnership with the Taibu Community Health Centre, which is an Afrocentric health centre, Black-led, providing an important community infrastructure service to marginalised communities in the Scarborough part of Toronto. As also with the Black Resilience Table, the Black Food Sovereignty Network, and other racialized community alliances across Toronto. In Brazil, our partners at SEBRAP worked with Quilombo Periférico, which is a racial justice collective that secured election to the São Paulo City Hall, with Agência Fraternidade, which works in the South Zone, with Casa do Povo in the center, São Remo Favela Collective in the West, and the MTST, the Homeless People's Movement. All of these movements became co-authors of case studies of their work, and I'll just share if the project website's in the chat. If you scroll down, you'll see a series of blogs that were co-authored by researchers from the SEBRAP team with activists from those groups. And in the UK, we work very closely with Bridging Change, so we're delighted to have Anusri on the call with us, and I hope she'll be able to speak in the dialogue afterwards about the networking across cities that the social movements and community groups were able to engage in. So Bridging Change works for racial justice in the city of Brighton and Hove in England, and has been very influential in challenging the NHS and the City Council on issues of racial injustice, and they also led our research on political voice and representation. So very strongly co-constructed with social movements, the same with Brighton and Hove Food Partnership on the food side, Brighton and Hove City Council, and NHS Sussex were also partners. And so we linked from this into a very strong policy engagement strand, which my colleague Jennifer Constantine, who's also on the call, will be able to speak to, including in partnership with Panex Youth, which is another TAP project, as I mentioned. And so Jenny can speak to that a bit in the call. That's included high-level engagements, including with the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care in the UK, as well as internationally with Canada and Brazil. So very briefly, I think I'm down to a minute or so. In terms of key findings, we experienced, we identified a lot of the challenges that other colleagues have reported back on in terms of sustainability. The polycrisis, the rolling succession of crises that has affected groups in relation to food justice, in relation to health, in relation to political voice and representation, have severely compromised the replication scalability of a lot of these grassroots innovations that we studied in food systems, in health, and in political representation. The networks and alliances that have been built have, in many cases, been sustained despite setbacks. There has been a permanent shift, or we hope permanent shift, in the institutional response in some areas, particularly around food justice in the City of Toronto and health in the UK, but the reversion to business as usual, and particularly the reversion to top-down decision-making, has compromised the ability of these grassroots innovations to achieve their full potential. So there are challenges around funding and the return to austerity, but we believe that there are actually more severe challenges around a reversion to bureaucratic decision-making as usual, and that one of the key lessons that we've had more difficulty getting traction with is the need to transform political culture in terms of decision-making, particularly in highly centralized policies like England, and to note that a lot of the successes of these innovations depended on the relaxation of norms, bureaucratic norms of compliance, and funding modalities, which tend to be exclusionary, tend to marginalize racialized and minoritized groups in terms of access to power and decision-making. And that relaxation during the pandemic was forced on the state by necessity, by the need for an urgent response. But it emphasizes how the pandemic was characterized as a state of exception, as an exceptional space in which you could do things differently, and that the reversion to business as usual, despite the ongoing polycrisis and despite the fact that food insecurity and health injustices are actually worse now than they were at the outset of the pandemic in many cases, that reversion has in itself in effect denied the fundamental insight from the researchers that it is possible to do things differently and make a difference in relation to inequities, particularly racialized inequities. The doing things differently piece is what we have seen least progress on in terms of state response, despite a greater commitment rhetorically to embedding tackling racial injustice across food policy and health policy, and to a certain extent, political voice and representation since the outbreak of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter. So that's a very brief summary of where we've got to, and I hope we'll have a chance in the chat, both for Nusri to speak about the South-South and South-North learning exchanges we had across social movements and community partners, and also for Jenny to share the work we've done with Panex and others in engaging with the Department of Health and Social Care in the UK and with UK-Brazil health policy exchanges as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alex, for this insight. And next we hear Roger Few and his team. I understand maybe several people want to speak on their project, Voices of Recovery, Recognizing Intersecting Risks, Capacities, and Pandemic Recovery Needs in Marginalized Communities of Latin America. Roger and team, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much, folks. Yeah, I think I'll just give the 5-minute spiel. But I will definitely be inviting my colleagues. I think I've got Helen Cristancho from Colombia and Iris Have from Peru to contribute during the discussion, I think. So we've just got 5 minutes. So I'm just going to share, I've actually distilled, there's a 4-pager that was attached to the invitation, but I've distilled it into one slide, which may be a mistake, but anyway, let me try and find that. Do I do that? Oh yeah, okay.
I've got it here, Roger, if you want me to share.
Has that worked? Has that shared?
I can't see it.
Okay, you share it, please, then, yeah. Holly. That will save me that. It's just one slide, so we don't have to shift between them. So, okay, so our project is called Voices of Recovery, recognizing intersecting risks, capacities, and pandemic recovery needs in marginalized communities of Latin America. By marginalized, we know that's a contentious term, but it's a term that I see that's been used in a number of the projects. It's a convenient, if obviously a challengeable term, but we're talking about elements of economic, social, cultural, and in many cases, sort of a geographical, physical marginalization from centers of power and economy. It's a collaboration between my own institution, UEA in UK, Universidad Católica in Peru, and a team led by McKenna Ulfe-Young, and Iris is a colleague on that team. Universidad de Caldas in Colombia, and Helen is leading that team now. Formerly was another colleague, Vicky Lugo, and Semaden in Brazil, which is the Disaster Monitoring and Alert Center, led by Liana Anderson. So our research was, I like to categorize it as a program of research, really, because we didn't have necessarily a unified project with a particular standardized methodology that was rolled out. And thematically, we were quite broad, but the idea was to try to understand the narratives and concerns from the grassroots. And to some extent, to then look at whether that's reflected, or the extent to which people perceive that to be reflected by institutions. I think we're probably a bit less successful in that second part, but we're definitely very successful in the first part. And the other thing to note in this is that the idea of engagement and impact is not something that we kind of saw as an end point. So in all the countries, the liaison with communities began right at the start. I'll say a little bit about which communities in a moment. So that they were setting the terms of what we actually looked at, and to some extent how we looked at it. And so from a research point of view, what we've done is kind of draw insights, both from the case studies themselves, but also some insights that are shared across the studies. But a really key part of it was the engagement aspect and work that was done collaboratively with communities to try to support voice and help people to articulate their needs. So we worked in effectively 3 separate locations in each of the 3 countries, in Peru, Colombia, and Brazil. In Peru, it was in Chenchamayo and Satipo provinces, in three Ashaninka communities. In Colombia, we worked in the Zona Cafetera, in the town of Marquetalia, and its rural district, which is actually depicted in the top photograph, as well as in Caquetá, in the Amazon. And in Brazil, we worked in the Essex and Flona reserves, which are around the Tapajós near Santarém, and to a lesser extent with Quilombola communities near Belém. So we were asking particularly about experiences and concerns in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was some focus on what happened during it, but particularly what happened in that sort of immediate rollout years. Themes that are very much echo what's been said before, but were central to what we were looking at right from the start, was how the vulnerabilities associated with COVID, and more specifically with the pandemic experience, interacted with and were magnified by interacted with pre-existing vulnerabilities, and how in many ways we found that the pandemic magnified those. Not in every sense, as we'll see, but particularly, for example, in relation to conflict, in the history of conflict in Colombia, the fears, the restrictions, the uncertainties that were associated with the pandemic very much reflected and were overlaid upon the experiences people had from many decades of conflict. So as we've seen from other projects, it's inseparable from these other crises. I'm slightly hesitant in using the term polycrisis. I have used it in other projects because it draws attention specifically to what might call crisis events. But many of these things are structural, deep-seated, almost like everyday crises, let's say, that people face. So I think it's important to see, particularly in contexts such as this, where you've got insecurity over land, there's conflict, environmental degradation, and a range of climatic hazards, for example. What became very clear from all the studies was an intensification of risks, intensification of violence externally and domestically faced by women, but also an increase in the burden of responsibility. So this is on the kind of deficit side of the pandemic experience. And the challenges for young people. So there was quite a lot of focus on young people, and we're producing a documentary and a digital book of the experiences of young people in Colombia and Brazil, particularly around education, but also around their sense of social isolation and how they've tried to manage that in the time since. All of this causes me to question the meaning and utility of the term recovery, particularly if we see it recovery from a particular isolated event seen in it. So if we think that's often how it's described, but it has no real meaning to the lived experience of people on the ground. So we need to, in many ways, it needs to be a reframing of how we look at this. And I think this is probably a common topic across many of the projects, that what recovery are we actually looking at? And I'll say a little bit more about that perhaps later. On the positive side, I'm hoping I've still got maybe a minute and a half.
A short minute.
Okay. But we did also feel there were some very strong elements that were coming out positively. In many cases, a reclamation of the ideas of solidarity, of communal ethics, the idea of cuidado, of communal care, was a very strong element that came out, and particularly when talking to women. Some implications for people's sense of agency. Mixed, I would suggest, but some ways there were opportunities for people to express a little bit more agency, perhaps, than there were people who were able to express in other times and potentially since. Another strong element that came out was in the absence of effective access to healthcare during the pandemic, the restoration of traditional practices, particularly around medicinal plants. Reflected actually in some of the engagement projects that we took part in. There was a lot of emphasis on creativity and creative arts and projects as vehicles for expression. And this was something that to some extent emerged, I believe, already in some of the case studies, but was also something that we tried to foster and use as a vehicle to assist people to deal with some of the consequences and to manage as I say, what I called it, the wake of the pandemic. And I think a key thing that I'd like to emphasize, and I will do now in all future research projects, is the recognition that the support you can give, the support you can offer, can go beyond the research outputs. So often, sort of, how's your research going to benefit? Well, the research itself may not yield many direct benefits in many cases. We can influence policy, but we know it's a very slow, partial process. But there are ways that research projects and the expertise that you bring to bear with communities, there are things that could be done to help strengthen capacities in ways that aren't necessarily related to the research outputs, but they are related to the expertise that you can bring. And I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about that with my colleagues later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. Thanks so much, Roger. Okay, so our last project team is led by Sophie Schramm from TU Dortmund. And the project is on the impact of COVID-19 of livelihoods, mobility, and accessibility of marginalized groups. Sophie, please, I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Could you share my slides, please?
Yeah, I will do. I'll just be 2 seconds to find them.
All right. So yes, thanks for giving me the opportunity to present here. I represent the eColma project, impact of COVID-19 on the livelihood, mobility, and accessibility of marginalized groups in the Ruhr region, Cape Town, and Sao Paulo Metro. These partner universities are the TU Dortmund in Germany, University of Cape Town, and University of Western Cape in South Africa, and Federal University of ABC in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Our research objectives are to analyze the criticality of second and third order impacts due to disruptions of the functionality of public transport, and to understand the changing roles of virtual versus physical access for marginalized groups, and to structure the impacts of COVID-19 along livelihood assets. Second slide. I cannot see the slides, but somehow that's probably because
we can see it.
Oh, great. Okay, so we employed 3 main research methods: criticality assessment, mobility biographies, and accessibility mapping, always sensitive to 3 moments in time: before, during, and after the pandemic, and all this feeds into our livelihood assessment. And our project lives from engagements with marginalized groups, where people, for example, doing housing occupations in Sao Paulo are active in our project, and maybe Sandra, who is also here from UFABC, can elaborate on that later on. We employed a qualitative research approach, and that involved doing a global comparison of 3 highly different places across 3 continents. And our ambition is to remain attentive to the specificities of every case, to learn from case to case and make places speak to each other in a south-north comparison. So concerning our first step, the criticality assessment provided a broader picture as a kind of entry point to understand how disruptions in public transport led to cascading effects in other sectors concerning food and nutrition, education, and healthcare. We found case study specific effects of public transport disruptions. For example, food security was a major issue in Cape Town. Next slide. We carried out thematic and cluster analysis, and overall in all 3 cities or case study regions, marginalized groups found overwhelming difficulties as expected shifting their activities online. But also physical access has decreased drastically and persistently in Cape Town, and to a lesser extent also in Sao Paulo and Dortmund. we employed a cluster analysis, and on this slide in the middle you see the Dortmund case, but we did this for all 3 case study regions. And this cluster analysis depicts differences among marginalized groups in terms of their financial situation and distances traveled in the 3 moments. For example, cluster 3 in the middle, you see in gray, remained quite stable financially and traveled less during the pandemic as compared to before and after. And cluster 5 in the bottom in gray pink was the same financially during the pandemic and worse afterwards, and they traveled a greater distance after the pandemic. In terms of the thematic analysis, we found that emotional distress played a very big role in Dortmund and also Sao Paulo, where people repeatedly reported experiencing fear and related that to social isolation. In order to make sense of these clusters, we identified illustrative cases that help to explain some of the relations between livelihood changes, virtual and physical access. Next slide, please. So we constructed a framework for our analysis of the ways in which the pandemic impacted the livelihoods of marginalized groups across the case study regions and how people were able to cope with the pandemic shock through virtual and physical mobilities. But again, COVID turned out not to be an isolated event, but kind of fed into a multi-crisis that, poly-crisis that continues to evolve in every of the 3 places. So here we provide a case that illustrates cluster 5 that was same financially during the pandemic, worse off after, and traveled more. This person owned a business before the pandemic and they tried to shift it online as the lockdown set in, but they failed, the business failed, and they had to seek work in a neighboring city here in the Ruhr region. According to them, unfortunately, my future is ruined, my capital is gone, I lost my clients. And on the other hand, in the cluster 3 that was stable throughout the pandemic, we found that people in this cluster were able to move their work and educational activities online rather smoothly, and that was one key to the relative stability of their livelihoods. We found similar dynamics in Cape Town, where most people were really heavily impacted by the pandemic. They had to move because of the pandemic. But one cluster of respondents was, we call it educated by the pandemic, in the sense that people in this particular cluster learned new digital skills or now have a generally better outlook on life. And maybe Moja Leffer, who is also here, wants to elaborate on that later on if we get the chance. So to wrap up, overall, our findings support the idea that the pandemic brought about a change in the balance between the accessibility dimensions of digital connectivity, spatial proximity, and physical mobility. Namely, during the pandemic, digital connectivity and spatial proximity increased while physical mobility declined, indicating a reconfiguration of accessibility patterns. After the pandemic, while distances traveled increased compared to the pandemic period, they did not fully return to pre-pandemic levels. Meanwhile, spatial proximity decreased and digital connectivity continued to see slight increases, however much less than during the pandemic, suggesting a lasting shift in accessibility patterns. But variations at the individual and cluster levels between case study regions indicate that the extent and nature of these shifts are place-specific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and for everyone who has presented on their projects. I know that the format is that normally we take first questions from the PIs, but maybe we can open that up directly. So for people to speak to the projects, if they want to mention anything that they feel needs to be emphasized, or to ask questions about other projects. Whilst people, okay, Sophie has already a comment. Please go ahead, Sophie. You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. So I am a PI, but I also want to give the chance to Sandra Mojaleva and Dorcas, who are here to speak. But I have a question to the other projects. Some of you, two questions actually. One is about what also Roger just mentioned, the topic of marginalization. So comparing Dortmund or Ruhr region, Sao Paulo and Cape Town, we found that marginalization takes on very different facets. And so we found that it became a project goal in itself to define what marginalization is. So we spent a lot of time discussing it, and it ended up not being a kind of fixed category, but defining it through the project. That's what we ended up doing. So I'm interested in learning how the others who compared different places worked with that, or which experiences they had. And the other one is the urban-rural aspect. So some projects worked in urban and rural areas, so I would be really interested in knowing whether they found any differences in pandemic impacts or also recovery needs or recovery possibilities. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. So Alex, do you want to go ahead and answer the question about the marginalization?
Actually, I wanted to invite my my colleagues because, so just to highlight, Sophie, yes, absolutely, there is heterogeneity across sites, but our starting point was that although absolute numbers of morbidity and mortality for Black and racialized populations across the three cities were different, the proportion of Black to white people being infected with and or suffering long-term consequences and or dying from COVID-19 was very similar, to roughly 2.5 to 1 proportion. So racial injustice in health is a commonality, and that was why we decided to look at the three cities in that way. They'd all seen political mobilizations around it, and they all had similar patterns of inequity in health. So that was where we started. But as to what we found, I wanted to invite Anusri to comment on what commonalities and differences she experienced in dialogue with social movement and grassroots actors in Sao Paulo and Toronto, and also Jenny to comment on the mutual learning process between Brazil, Canada, and the UK in terms of what relevant lessons for the UK came out of those very different contexts, if that's okay. Can we give a couple of minutes to each of my colleagues?
Sure.
Thank you, Sarah. Anusri or Jenny, I don't know if either of you wants to start.
Jenny or the other person. Please go ahead. The people from your team.
I'm hoping they're able to unmute. Anusri was struggling with her microphone. Anusri, are you able to unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it was quite an interesting thought. That's a very interesting question actually, because marginalization does look differently in Sao Paulo than it does in Brighton. And for us in Brighton, we struggled around getting our voices heard. And whilst Nora and I, who was sitting next to me, we were sitting in quite sort of significant boards, trying to get our agenda through was particularly difficult. And also, I think whilst on the surface, there was a tick box exercise where we certainly did have space to speak. Often it was exactly a tick box exercise. And I think our grassroots work were also quite a struggle as well. So often we were sidelined, and often funds were given to larger organizations that were white-led, and we were given very tokenistic kind of projects to do, if at all. And then nothing came from it. So there was often no feedback loop when we were working with larger institutions. So it was always, we did feel quite sidelined. So we've worked quite hard in the meantime over the period of this project, where we've been able to, through a project that we do is around community voices, where we bring in commissioners and leads from the council or health, where we challenge them through community, the communities do it through a voice, and we have a structure where we call them in, we give them a bit of a grilling in terms of questions, and then we follow up, which is not what usually happens. Usually it gets lost. So we've been quite tenacious, if you don't mind me saying, about our own work, about trying to pursue particular agendas. So for instance, just an example, in mental health, which, there's lots of discussions around minoritized ethnic people and mental health. We've been able to change commissioning criteria about how they include and how they involve organizations in that work. So that is now a part of the commissioning spec. So that has had huge impact, and also on education. I will stop speaking. But in education, for instance, we're able to change and implement changes according to around racist incidents, for instance. But when you're looking at Brazil, for instance, there's a real I don't know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the ground, and people seem more cohesive here. We have lots of fragmentation within ourselves about who's fighting to provide support, get help, be enabled to do that work. So it looks very different. Well, so we saw lots of a mobilization around food access in Brazil, people coming together, people having a shared purpose. I think for us, we have less of that. I think because we are minoritized within, we are a minority group in terms of numbers, and also we're quite diverse, and it makes it difficult for us to mobilize sometimes. And I think that was what I found. I don't know if I've answered your question. I hope I went some part too.
Yeah, thank you so much for these interesting elaborations. Roger wanted to speak as well. I'm not sure, is it for the first question? I think the second question was also for you, the question on in urban and rural projects, what's the differences in working during a pandemic versus not working in a pandemic? I think that's a very interesting question as well.
Yeah, and I'm on that one. I think maybe I'll invite Helen if you're ready to, because I know that in some of the sites in Colombia, there was some different experiences of urban and rural that come through. Of course, they're never completely distinct. It's a gradation of difference, of course, and of course an urban community is not homogenous, neither is a rural one. But before I come to you, Helen, also on the question of marginalisation, so we really struggled, and to be honest with you, with the term is there in the title as a shorthand, and it essentially refers to major pre-existing pressures, populations that faced major pre-existing pressures, and we're looking then at the how COVID overlays on top of that. But it's a contentious term. It depends how it's used. To refer to a group as marginalised is a label, but I think if you give a kind of a definition of what you're talking about as a marginalisation, it becomes a little easier. But it's not a wonderful term. But can I offer the chance for Helen and maybe Iris to say anything about urban-rural difference and concepts of marginalisation?
Okay, please. And then we go to Luke. After that, we go to Luke. Okay, please go ahead.
Helen, por favor.
Helen
is
on the call.
Yeah. Tal vez Iris.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I speak in Spanish for the question. Nosotros trabajamos en dos comunidades, una comunidad indígena que es más urbana, que está pegada a la ciudad, es parte de la ciudad, y otra que es más rural, que está a 6 horas de la ciudad. Eso lo digo para entender también las contradicciones que enfrentan hoy las propias comunidades acerca de la marginalidad, ¿no? En algunos casos se sienten marginales porque no acceden a los derechos o a toda la medicina o las políticas públicas acerca del COVID. Pero al mismo tiempo tienen que construir su propia agencia para poder enfrentar esa situación. Una situación que viene desde hace muchos años, cuyas desigualdades son ancestrales, pero al mismo tiempo desarrollan una agencia que tiene que ver con el cuidado de los bosques, con la recuperación de plantas, que tiene que ver también con la disputa porque las mujeres asuman más liderazgos en sus comunidades. Entonces hay digamos, un conflicto permanente para ver desde dónde se habla de marginalidad, ¿no? Desde las propias comunidades, nosotros hemos intentado recoger sus propias narrativas, qué es lo que ellas entienden o qué es lo que ellos comprenden acerca de la situación en que viven. Desde fuera, como investigadores, podemos ver que hay una marginalidad permanente, ancestral, ¿no? Pero creo que es interesante también mirar cómo desde dentro se ven ellos, cómo se perciben ellos, y eso es lo que hemos tratado de recoger y creo que hay que discutir ese concepto porque es problemático desde donde se aborde, ¿no? Eso. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Iris. So basically the concept for those, I don't know if everyone speaks Spanish, but basically the emphasis on what Iris said is that it's important to listen to the people that we are referring to as marginalized and how they conceptualize themselves. So the concept of agency is really important to consider. And so with that, I pass on to Luke Parry.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to contribute to this idea of rural-urban differences. And I wanted to clarify that we did rural and urban fieldwork, but our urban fieldwork was almost exclusively in relation to rural populations. So we wanted to understand how different workers within state institutions and NGOs understood the challenges and rights of rural populations. And in general, there was a lack of recognition of people's right to health, and instead it was seen more as going above and beyond and favours, all linked to clientelism and, you know, social and political hierarchies in these contexts. But although, you know, the majority of our fieldwork focused on rural experiences, I guess in many places, the notion of being rural or urban is a bit of a kind of false dichotomy, because people's lives often link through their mobilities and flows of money and people, and people go to study, and so even people living in quite remote areas have very strong links to urban spaces and might spend periods of time living in an urban periphery, for example.
Okay, thank you, Luke. Are there any other questions or comments that people want to? Yes, there's Helen is writing something in the chat. I don't know if I should just read it out. Helen, can you connect? Okay, she's writing it in the chat. Alex is raising his hand. Okay.
There is, just to highlight that I think Jenny's got her hand up. I think she was going to speak also to the contrasts and similarities across the cities.
Let me then first, sorry, Alex, to interrupt, but let me then first go to Jenny because she has been up longer. Yeah, thank you so much for raising this. Okay, thanks.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, just briefly actually, because I need to shoot off to do school pickup, but it was just following on from the point Alex had made earlier about the learning across the three contexts, and also tying to a couple of things that colleagues said now around kind of recognition of rights. And obviously, in terms of access to right to food and right to health, it varied quite differently across the three contexts. But I think in terms of the learning, whilst there was a lot of learning on the more technical side of things, so how are community kitchens organised, or how do you organise the funding, how how do kind of health councils work, all that kind of stuff, very important, very valuable. We've got some really interesting cases. But I think what came out really strongly was actually the kind of route to getting things embedded so that they translate to commissioning services. And I think it's the point about the politicization of civil society and the kind of access that they do or don't have to the state that really differed. It's what Anasri and Nora were referring to just now. And so I think Brazil's experience of entering policy through social movements and through some pretty sharp-elbowed politics was really valuable, and it made partners, at least here in Brighton and Hove and across England, think, okay, maybe we need to be working a little bit differently. And the experience in Toronto was also that as a result of Black Lives Matter, the city had responded very differently to the role of Black and people of colour, their role in informing decision-making processes. So I think, it's not enough to have the structure of rights, is it there legally or not, but it's actually how are those rights enacted.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So now, Alex, please.
Sure, yes, thank you. Just to complement that briefly. So Jenny mentioned structures, and I think that's really important. I mentioned before the issue about centralization in England. And what we found was that because municipal governments in Brazil are much more empowered than in the UK, when the Racial Justice Collective Quilombo Periférico got elected to the city council, first of all, they were able to do so because of the electoral system, because they had a cross-city mandate due to proportional representation. But secondly, there was much more space to make change than there is in English local government. Similarly, in Canada, because Canada, the provincial level is much stronger, Canada is a federal country, they were able to commission directly Black-led services at the subnational level, which again is something that's harder to see in the UK. And finally, I just wanted to note that's on the kind of policy engagement and engaged research aspect, but academically, we also found ourselves drawing on conceptual frameworks from the three countries. So Brazilian social movement scholars' works on the institutionalization of social movement agendas in policy was quite influential in our thinking about sustainability, and similarly our Canadian colleagues working on collective capability and relational governance was also influential in our conceptual framework. So it was a co-construction with grassroots actors, but it was also a co-construction across the three countries in terms of our conceptual framing of what it took for a grassroots innovation to be sustained and to impact on inequalities. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Alex. Also very important. Roger, you're next.
Yeah, thanks very much. Actually, a question probably primarily to you, Sophie, because you looked explicitly at psychosocial dimensions and psychosocial support. And the anxieties that came up very strongly in your, was it survey methodology? Am I right to say? Yeah. It came out very strongly. And I was wondering if there was, that could be explained or linked in any way to the other issues that were being faced. So the pandemic or the experience of the disease itself, did you sense that it was something that was exacerbating pre-existing issues that perhaps would lead to psychosocial problems?
Yeah, thank you. Definitely. So one term that came to our minds was the pandemic as a kind of catalyst of developments that were going on before. So it accelerated things. And so in terms of Dortmund, what we noticed was that anxiety and fear played a great role, and people were very negative on their personal outlooks, even if kind of materially the situation was stable. So for example, the person I cited, they still have a job, they managed to get a new job. Nevertheless, they have a very negative outlook. And maybe Sandra, do you want to elaborate on this point in terms of Brazil? Because anxiety and fear was also a big issue among the people that you interviewed.
Yes, thank you. In case of Brazil, in fact, we found difference between the three cities related the impact of COVID, of pandemic. No, for example, in case of Brazil, for sure we have this anxiety, fear, and this negative emotions. But in the opposite, we found too many situations related to this solidarity and some good change. For example, marginalized people found during the pandemic resources from social movements, from cohesion between other people in occupations, or from the government. And in our case, we have multiple emotions, not only negative, less than in Germany, for example. No,
This is really interesting. But in this point, we found too in the literature, in urban literature related to global south cities, about there is no so big difference between after and during, before and during pandemic, because this situation of these people were bad before the pandemic, and then during the pandemic they found new resources that were not available before the pandemic. This is a typical situation. We can find this in the literature about the global cities, cities in the global south.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Our time is theoretically off. If there is another question, maybe we can take one more. And if someone wants to make some summarize or concluding remarks about their project, I would give you the opportunity. I also want to draw your attention to the chat where people left remarks, like Helen and Luke have given some great comments there as well to look at. Okay. Yes, Roger, please go ahead.
I just want to take the opportunity to say a little bit more about my final point. And I'd like to get reflections from others who are experienced in doing research projects. But increasingly, I'm trying to sort of build in this model whereby, particularly when working with communities facing all sorts of difficulties. Of course, the immediate question you hear is, what are you going to do for me? And it's always felt a bit hollow to say, yeah, well, we're going to study this, we're going to disseminate our results, and hopefully it will help you. It's clearly important that we do that. But I sort of feel that as part of the social contract, as researchers, as visitors going in, we should always look for ways that we can actually do something more directly. And I think one of the key things we have, and we can quite easily do within research projects, is forms of capacity strengthening. So, for example, Iris, I know that your team, because you had legal experts and people raised the issue of land titles as being critical, not necessarily as part of the research, but there were sort of workshops done to help people sort of understand their entitlements. In Colombia, the wonderful Colombian team organized a number of community-based activities or facilitated them, but they were driven by what the community wanted. And because of the history of conflict and displacement in the country, one example was a peace garden where people were able to develop a local resource for medicinal plants. And with a little bit of resource, a little bit of assistance from the team, we're able to facilitate this. And I think that should be part of the social contract of research, particularly when one's working with communities like this. Iris, do you want to say anything quickly about the legal assistance that I think Roxana gave? Or Iris? I understand Roxana worked with some of the communities around legal rights.
Roxana trabaja con comunidades, con mujeres indígenas, porque ella es abogada también.
Yeah, okay. So that was one element that, oh, sorry. ¿Siga? No.
No. Y yo trabajaba antes con estas comunidades en diplomados de gobernanza e incidencia política, realizando estrategias de incidencia política, porque estas personas son sujetos políticos también, se desarrollan como sujetos políticos. Entonces, creo que también como investigadores hacemos un vínculo de intercambio de conocimientos también todo el tiempo, de forma permanente, ¿no?
Yeah, so knowledge exchange is important, of course, in the projects. I think, yeah, for me, this is also very interesting and important to hear all your discussions as we are in this planning phase of building community connections in our project. So I really appreciate this discussion. Maybe Luke has also mentioned that they had a similar structure of legal advocacy and advice. So maybe you can connect further and exchange how you have established the structure in the future. I think that would be also very exciting. Yeah, so we are unfortunately coming to an end. I would have loved to have more discussions because I find all your projects so exciting and your findings and also the processes that you described of working together. I think this is so relevant, and it's, I think, fantastic that we do have the opportunity through the Transatlantic platform to do this work. So I congratulate you for all the great work that you have been doing and are still doing, and I'm really looking forward to seeing and reading the different findings and links and impact that you have created through your project. So thank you so much, everyone, and yeah, it was great meeting you all.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and we and apologies for a bumpy start related to the sound issues. So I believe unfortunately, we are coming to an end. So we just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be part of today's meeting, for those very, very insightful discussions, for your very valuable contributions. So in terms of next steps, we will publish the summaries and the material you provided on the TAP website. We will then reach out to each team to discuss the idea of creating policy briefs and how we can do that. We will also reach out to teams to discuss the idea of what can the transatlantic platform do in utilizing the impact of your projects, and yeah, and I think particularly in relation to the breakout group discussions we had yesterday and today, there has been a lot of very, very useful suggestions for us to take forward in future calls and to reflect upon how we improve our processes going forward. So a big thank you to everyone for your time, for your dedication, commitment, and it was a pleasure. And of course, feel free to keep in touch, to reach out to the coordination office with some additional feedback you might have, some additional ideas you might have. We would welcome that very much. So thanks. Have a lovely, restful weekend, and thank you again for all your efforts.